jumping back now into the action and looking at two situations that I found very fascinating of how they've developed so far in this 2024 NFL season. Arguably, the two best teams in the NFL, definitely from last year, right, making the Super Bowl, and arguably this year, right? Apart from the loss that the Vikings suffered, I think the 49ers and the Chiefs are definitely among, right, the top of the NFL hierarchy in the best teams in the league. So, with that being the case, they're both dealing with some concerning injuries to a lot of their stars already so early on in this year. You look at the Kansas City Chiefs injuries and what they're dealing with. You look at Hollywood Brown, the big offseason acquisition for the Chiefs. He had shoulder surgery because of an injury he suffered in a preseason game, and what looked like a situation where he could have came back in week 2, maybe even this week, turned very sour when they decided to get shoulder surgery. They decided that it was going to be better for him long term, and that way they placed him on the IR, but ultimately it got to a level where reports came out from ESPN and a bunch of different sources that Marquise Brown was likely to miss the entire regular season. He could be back for the playoffs, but still a massive blow for Hollywood Brown to not be incorporated in this team at all in the regular season. And then also just off the back of last week's game against the Bengals, Isiah Pacheco, their starting running back, was diagnosed with a fractured right fibula. So he's set to miss now 6 to 8 weeks. That's a month and a half to 2 months now. He will be going on IR, and those are, I mean, you could say that Hollywood Brown, we don't know what he could have been, but projecting and staying true to those projections of how impactful Hollywood Brown could have been off of that fact, and losing your starting running back now also, those are pretty big injuries now, especially with how Travis Kelce has looked also as well. These are pretty concerning for the Chiefs. And now also looking at the other team, the San Francisco 49ers, Christian McCaffrey, right, one of the biggest injury stories. He was dealing with a calf strain all throughout training camp. He didn't play in the preseason, obviously. He didn't play in week 1. Then as the days went on, Kyle Shanahan updated everyone and mentioned how this has developed into some sort of Achilles tendonitis, which was arguably more worrying because it isn't something that is always brought up as something that's very significant or severe. But he did mention, if you know Achilles tendonitis or know anything about it, it just makes the calf and the Achilles obviously a bit more susceptible to a tear potentially, right? Tearing that Achilles tendon, and that's the last thing we want to see with Christian McCaffrey, right? If that happens, his season's over. So with this developing a bit more into that Achilles tendonitis, they placed him on IR, and he'll miss the next 4 weeks after that decision. And also, again, after their last game in the loss to the Minnesota Vikings, Deebo Samuel also suffered a calf strain, and now he's set to miss a couple of weeks as well. And you look at both teams, one of their best wide receivers, their 2 starting running backs for both teams are now out injured. And where does that leave us now with these injuries, right? Which one should we be worried about more if I have any 49ers or Chiefs fans listening or something like that? Which ones do seem a bit more worrying at this point in the year? And I think we have to start with the fact that the next 5 games for both of these teams look like this. The Chiefs in the next 5 games have the Atlanta Falcons on the road. They'll travel to Atlanta, and that game is going to be pretty tricky, with the win that the Atlanta Falcons just got. Then they travel to the Los Angeles Chargers. They host the New Orleans Saints. Then they ironically play the 49ers after that. And lastly, in these next 5 games, they travel to Las Vegas in another matchup of that mini grudge match, mini rivalry that is brewing there. So not the easiest of schedules, right, based on who they have in their next 5 games. And on the other side, the 49ers, in their next 5 games, they play at the Los Angeles Rams. They play at home against the Patriots and then the Arizona Cardinals. They travel to Seattle, and then in that final 5-game stretch there, they host the Kansas City Chiefs, right? the Chiefs have a bye week in week 6, whereas the 49ers have a bye week in week 9. That's why it lines up a bit funny, right? Where the Chiefs play one more game extra. It's because they have a bye week in week 6. So that's why it kind of lines up like that. But regardless of that, I think obviously when we're talking about this question and creating an answer for it and how you base your answer off of that, I feel like both teams are very fortunate, right, to have two of the best play callers, two of the best coaches in the NFL, and also still some of the best players in the league, right? Brock and Patrick and George and Rashee Rice to an extent as well, looking very good. Brandon Ayuk for the 49ers still. They have still a lot of talented players, so that's right gonna ease up some of the impact from the losses of McCaffrey and Pacheco and Hollywood Brown and Deebo, right? But still, the level of uncertainty you're able to kind of project is a little bit wavering, just because you look at the Chiefs and they did manage to go to 2-0, right, after their win against the Kansas City Chiefs, whereas the 49ers fell to 1-1 after losing to the Minnesota Vikings. And the entire strength of schedule for both of these teams is about middle of the league. I think the 49ers have the 13th or 14th toughest schedule in the NFL, whereas the Chiefs have like the 16th or 17th hardest, right? So they're right there. That doesn't create that big of a difference. But I think when we look at the games and we look at the next 5 matchups, I'm a bit more worried about Kansas City just because of those opponents, right? I mentioned how the Falcons, coming off of that big win, they like to run the ball and have ran the ball very well. Their defense looks much improved just from last year, and I worry that the Chiefs aren't able to be as balanced and answer the time of possession or look as efficient without Isiah Pacheco back there. I think he is very underrated. You know, he's not talked about as much as obviously Patrick and Travis and now Rashee Rice. He brings so much to this offense that can create such a difference when opposing defenses, opposing players try to tackle him, right? The way that he runs, how aggressive he is. That all has to do with what he brings to the table. So not having him, I'm worried about that in that matchup against the Falcons, where their own running back is very, very good. So that worries me a little bit, right? And then you look at the Los Angeles Chargers, the next game on the Chiefs schedule. They look very stout in the running game. I think over the last 2 weeks, they ran it like 50-something times with J.K. Dobbins and Gus Edwards combined. Despite the opponents, right, they're playing the Panthers and the Raiders, who might not be the toughest of opponents, but it's similar to Atlanta, right? This is a team that wants to run the ball, that wants to, create an ugly, low-scoring matchup, and I think the Chiefs maybe don't have the guys at their disposal to be able to keep up with how J.K. Dobbins is looking, with what Gus Edwards brings, and it makes it a bit more even when one team is so much better in the run game as opposed to the other team. And then it's also a divisional game, and those always seem to be a bit closer than anybody ever thinks. So that's another game. The Saints look extremely explosive on offense, and their defense is also pretty solid. So the fact that the Chiefs are playing in Arrowhead does soften the blow a little bit, but another team with another great running back coming in there and an arguably better defense, and how they're playing with Clint Kubiak could be a sneaky game in there as well, with the losses of Hollywood Brown and now Isiah Pacheco. And it's also, just very interesting when they play each other at, I think it's week, what is it? It's week 5. The next 5 games. This is 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Week 7 or 6 when they play each other. We'll see who's back by then. Deebo could be back, but if none of them are back, who, benefits off of the losses, right? Jordan Mason's looking good, but we don't really know what we're going to get out of Carson Steele or Samaje Perine or Kareem Hunt that is reportedly coming back to the Kansas City Chiefs, right? All of those things, I think, affect my thoughts on this discussion, right, between the 49ers and the Chiefs and which injuries I worry about more. Obviously, a lot of that is taken away when you have the best player in football in Patrick Mahomes, but I think last year we saw how human he could look in some of those games where the offense was really missing a dynamic weapon on offense where it just looks stagnant and just not as talented as before. We saw a glimpse of that last year, and I worry that we could be heading there again this year in some of these games. And just overall, the 49ers should just have more favorable matchups, in my opinion. The Rams should have been a tough game, but their entire team is hurt. The Patriots, not necessarily one of the tougher teams anybody will say they will play. The Arizona Cardinals and the Seattle Seahawks, while it is a divisional game for both of those, I'm still holding out on the fact that they are a legit threat until they play better competition. The Seattle Seahawks, I should say, more so than the Cardinals, because the Cardinals put up a good fight against the Bills. So still the Seahawks, I still need to see more out of them. But I feel like San Francisco has more of an established group to kind of share the load, right, with Ayuk and Kittle, and only having to incorporate really Jordan Mason as a new guy into this offense, whereas the Chiefs have to do a lot more with a rookie in Xavier Worthy, another rookie in Carson Steele, and Kareem Hunt coming back after, not playing, not being in training camp or anything like that. Travis Kelce not looking like he usually does in the regular season, and Rashee Rice only still being in his second year. As good as he's looked, he's only a second-year player, so putting more responsibility on a lot more guys, younger guys, I think also gives me a bit more doubt about this Chiefs team and how they handle these injuries. So I'm definitely more worried about them. Does this threaten any sort of three-peat? Probably not. They're going to get their guys back, but could this affect the number one seed or something like that if the Bills keep playing like they do, or the Texans are as good as they are? Potentially. So they could lose out on that, but once the playoffs start, all bets are off. But at this point, I am a bit more worried about the Kansas City Chiefs from an injury standpoint compared to the 49ers. And lastly here, we have one more segment to get to, more on the defensive side of the ball. Which defense out of the Jets, the Eagles, and the Cowboys has worried me the most going forward, and which one could struggle to overcome these issues a lot more as we move on? That is coming up right after the break. You're listening to the GSMC Chip Shot Football Podcast.